Every August, I used to stand in the kitchen with a pan of syrup on the stove, waiting for it to cool, because the flow had ended and it felt wrong to do nothing. I fed every colony in the yard. I felt responsible doing it. And I now know that most of those hives did not need a drop of what I gave them, and that in one or two of them, I started something I then had to spend a fortnight fixing. Feeding during a dearth is one of the most common and least questioned practices in beekeeping. It is often harmless. It is not neutral. What follows is what I got wrong, what changed my mind, and what I do instead. And the short version is that most of the improvement came from doing less rather than doing something better. Here is the thing that took longest to see. Syrup is not simply food that either gets used or does not. Every feeder that goes into a hive changes the moisture inside it, changes the odor leaving the entrance, changes what the colony believes about the season, and changes what the queen does next. Some of those effects are what you wanted, some are not, and which ones apply depends entirely on what that particular colony needed on that particular day. The problem was never the feeding. The problem was feeding without asking whether anything needed feeding. If this biology first breakdown is useful to you, a like helps more beekeepers find it. There is a version of this argument that turns into never feed, and that version kills colonies. Some hives in August genuinely need it, and hesitating with those is its own failure. But a pan on the stove and a feeder in every box because it is August is not a decision. It is a habit wearing the costume of one. Before any of the mechanism, there is a check that settles the question for most hives and takes about 4 seconds each. Stand behind the hive, get your fingers under the back edge of the bottom box, and lift, not to pick it up, just until you feel the weight take. A colony with adequate stores resists. A light one comes up easily, and the difference is unmistakable once you have felt both on the same afternoon. Do the whole row that way before you decide anything. Most beekeepers never heft, and it is the single fastest piece of information available about whether a colony needs anything at all. Do it on the same afternoon rather than across a week, because what you are reading is the difference between hives rather than any absolute figure, and your own arm is a perfectly good instrument for that. After a season of doing it, you will know your own equipment well enough that the light ones announce themselves before you have straightened up. There is a second reading available at the same time, and it costs nothing extra. As you tilt each box, note whether anything comes back at you from the entrance. A guard or two on a heavy hive is ordinary, while a colony that boils out at a slight tilt is telling you something about its temper that is worth knowing before you decide to open it. What the heft is really measuring is not weight, but the gap between hives. And that gap is the whole decision. 2 colonies on the same stand in the same week under the same forage should feel broadly similar. When one does not, that hive has done something the others did not. Swarmed, been robbed, failed to build, or been taken from too heavily at harvest. And it is that history, rather than the calendar, that determines whether it needs anything. Before we go further, one small and genuine request. If this is useful to you, subscribing genuinely helps. It signals that careful, historically grounded beekeeping is worth showing to more people. In the comments, it would be good to know, do you feed in August as a matter of routine, or only when a colony tells you it needs it? And if you would like to support the work more directly, joining the channel is a little like buying us a coffee. No grand promises, just a way to help keep these breakdowns coming. That is all. Now, back to the bees. The answers to that one tend to split beekeepers into two groups more cleanly than almost any other question. The starting point that took me longest to accept is this. A colony with adequate honey stores and active foraging needs nothing from you. And the best feeding decision is very often no feeding at all. The dearth is not an emergency the beekeeper has to solve. It is an ordinary event the colony has been preparing for since spring. I resisted that idea for a long time, partly because it sounds like an excuse for laziness, and partly because it removes the thing a beekeeper can most easily do in a month when there is little else to do. But every year I have fed less by default and looked more before deciding. The apiary has come through better, and I no longer think that is a coincidence. It is also the least satisfying advice in beekeeping, which is part of why it spreads so poorly. The dearth is not an emergency the beekeeper has to solve. It is an ordinary event the colony has been preparing for since spring, and the preparation is what the stores in the box actually are. That is worth sitting with, because it runs against the instinct completely. Flowers stop, and a beekeeper feels a shortage. The colony does not experience it that way. It spent the whole flow converting surplus into a store precisely because this period was coming. And when the forage ends, it does what it has always done. It slows the burn. The queen reduces her laying, foraging effort drops, and the colony lives off what it put away. That contraction is not a colony in trouble. It is a colony operating correctly, and a beekeeper who reads it as decline will intervene in something that was working. The signals that cause the anxiety are mostly the signals of that contraction working. Fewer bees at the entrance because there is nothing to fetch. A brood nest that has stopped expanding because expanding now would be a mistake. No weight gain because nothing is coming in. Read individually, each looks like a problem. Read together, they describe a colony doing arithmetic correctly. And the two situations look identical from 10 feet away. A colony contracting on schedule and a colony running out of food both show quiet entrances and no gain. The only thing separating them is what is actually in the box. That is the whole reason the hefting comes first rather than the feeding, and why an apiary that looks worrying in August is not evidence of anything until the boxes have been lifted. So what does syrup actually do in a colony that did not need it? The first effect is the one nobody mentions, and it is the reason I stopped feeding thin syrup in warm weather at all. Thin syrup is mostly water, and every drop of it has to be evaporated off inside the hive before the bees can store what remains. In August, that lands on a box already working to stay cool and dry, at the point in the year when its ventilation effort is highest. And if the colony cannot process it fast enough, it turns. In warm, humid conditions, syrup can ferment within 3 to 5 days, releasing alcohol and other byproducts that are harmful and can bring on dysentery. Feed a colony cannot keep up with stops being feed. There is a temperature dimension that is easy to underestimate. The warmer the weather, the faster syrup sours, and the harder the colony is already working on humidity. So the season in which thin syrup is most likely to be offered is also the season it suits least. In cool autumn weather, the same feed behaves quite differently. The second effect is the one that genuinely changes how a beekeeper should think about the bag of sugar, because it is not about nutrition at all. The concentration of what goes into the hive is a message. Thin syrup mixed 1-to-1 has roughly the sugar concentration of natural nectar, and the colony reads it exactly that way. It tells the queen resources are abundant and prompts her to lay more and the colony to draw comb. That is the correct signal in April. In late August, it tells a colony preparing to contract that the flow has resumed, and it responds by expanding at precisely the moment it should be doing the opposite. Heavy syrup mixed 2-to-1 carries no such message. It is dense enough that the bees process and store it with little effort, and it reads as stores rather than as a flow. The two also behave differently once in the comb. Thin syrup must have most of its water driven off before it can be capped, occupying cells while contributing little to the weight that matters. Heavy syrup is close enough to finished that it can be put away with far less work, which is why the same weight of sugar delivered thick shows up in the hive faster than delivered thin. That is the distinction I wish someone had put to me plainly 20 years earlier, because I had always thought of the ratio as a strength setting. Thin when you want to be gentle, thick when you want to be serious. It is not a strength setting. It is a sentence, and the colony believes it. Everything else in this video follows from that one idea. A colony does not taste concentration as a preference. It reads it as information about the world outside, and it commits resources on the strength of what it reads. Get the message right, and everything downstream is easier. Get it wrong, and you spend the autumn arguing with a colony that is doing exactly what you told it to do. The practical consequence is that the same bag of sugar can be two entirely different interventions depending on how much water goes in with it. And the difference is not a matter of degree. The third effect I learned the hard way, on an afternoon I still think about. I had filled an entrance feeder on a hive at the end of a row, spilled a good splash of it down the front of the box, and gone to make a cup of tea. By the time I came back out, there were bees in the air in front of that hive that did not belong to it. And by evening, I was closing the entrance down with grass. In a dearth, every colony within range has foragers out looking for exactly what I had just poured down the woodwork. Open feeding and careless entrance feeders escalate robbing reliably, which is why internal feeders and reduced entrances are the standard answer. The syrup was not the mistake. Advertising it was. The lesson I took was not to stop feeding. It was that syrup outside the box is a completely different object from syrup inside it. Inside a hive, it is food. Anywhere else in an apiary during a dearth, it is a broadcast. And there are several thousand foragers within flight range whose entire job that week is finding exactly that signal. The other thing I learned that afternoon was how fast it moves. Robbing does not build over days the way most beekeeping problems do. It escalates within the hour as more foragers are recruited to a discovered source. By the time it is obvious enough to see from across the yard, a good deal of the damage is already done, and the intervention that works is the one that was in place beforehand. The practical rule that came out of it is simple enough. Nothing sweet is ever open in the apiary during a dearth. Not for a minute. Not while making tea. Syrup goes from the container into the feeder inside the box, and the lid goes back on. And anything spilled gets rinsed off rather than left to dry. There is a fourth cost that is quieter and shows up months later. Sugar syrup is carbohydrate and nothing else. A colony fed generously through a dearth can be heavy, busy, and entirely convincing, while the thing it actually needs is protein. Because the bees being raised in late summer are the ones that have to survive until spring, and they are built from pollen rather than from sugar. A colony can feel reassuring on the hive tool in September and be nutritionally hollow. Wait is not the same as readiness, and syrup is very good at producing the first while doing nothing for the second. That is the failure mode most worth avoiding, because it is invisible at the time and only reports itself in February. A colony can be fed into looking exactly like a colony that is ready, and the difference between looking ready and being ready is a distinction the hive tool cannot make. None of which means feeding is wrong, and that needs saying before this turns into a slogan. There are colonies in August that will die without it. A late swarm with nothing put by, a colony that was robbed out, a nucleus that is not built, a hive from which too much was taken at harvest. For those, feeding is not optional, and hesitating is the error. The argument is not against feeding. It is against feeding as a seasonal ritual applied to a whole apiary without asking any hive whether it wanted anything. The distinction worth holding is between feeding as a response and feeding as a routine. A response is triggered by something a hive did or failed to do, aimed at that hive, and it stops when the situation is corrected. A routine is triggered by the calendar, applied to everything, and has no natural end because nothing about it was measured. Almost all the harm done with a feeder comes from the second kind. The test for which kind you are doing is whether you could name, before opening the sugar, which specific hives are getting it and why. If the answer is all of them because it is August, that is a routine. What I do now takes an afternoon and starts with the row rather than the stove. I heft every hive from the back and sort them into 3 piles in my head: heavy, uncertain, light. The heavy ones get nothing, and walking past a hive with the feeder still in the truck is a discipline that took me a long time to learn. The uncertain ones get opened briefly and looked at. How much capped store is actually there? Is the brood nest being backfilled? Is there pollen coming in? The light ones get fed, and they get fed properly rather than token. The 3-pile sort is doing more work than it sounds like. It converts a whole apiary decision, which I am bad at, into a series of single hive decisions, which I am much better at, and it front-loads the part that costs nothing. Most seasons, more than half the row ends up in the heavy pile, and I never open a bag of sugar for them at all. The uncertain pile is where the actual skill sits, and it is the only one that costs an inspection. The heavy pile gets walked past, which sounds trivial and is the part that took longest to learn. There is a particular reluctance to walk away from a hive with a feeder in the truck, and that reluctance is worth recognizing for what it is. Properly, at this point in the season, means heavy syrup rather than thin. 2 parts sugar to 1 part water, given in an internal feeder, in quantity, so the colony can process and store it rather than living on it hand to mouth. That carries the stores message rather than the flow message. It holds far less water to evaporate. It ferments far more slowly. And it is what actually raises the weight of a hive going into autumn. Thin syrup in August solves a problem that mostly does not exist and creates several that do. Quantity matters as much as ratio and gets less attention. A token amount in a dearth gets eaten as it arrives and leaves the colony no further forward, which produces the frustrating experience of feeding steadily and watching a hive gain nothing. Timing sits alongside it. Feed late enough and the colony cannot cap what it is given before the weather closes in, leaving uncapped syrup in the comb going into winter. Earlier and heavier beats later and thinner on both counts. And it goes in at dusk, with the entrance reduced, with nothing spilled, and with the feeder inside the box rather than at the entrance. Every one of those 4 is about the rest of the apiary rather than about the hive being fed. And every one of them is a lesson somebody learned expensively before I did. The feeder inside the box in particular is worth being stubborn about. An entrance feeder in a dearth is a sign hung on the front of the hive, and I have taken enough of them off in a hurry to stop putting them on. None of those 4 is about the hive being fed. All of them are about the 20 other colonies within flight range that are also short of forage and also looking. The protein side gets handled separately because the 2 are not interchangeable, and treating them as one thing is how colonies end up heavy and hollow at the same time. If natural pollen is collapsing while the colony is rearing the generation that has to see the winter through, that is a protein question with a protein answer. Sugar cannot substitute for it, and no amount of syrup will produce a well-provisioned nurse bee. Kept separate, both decisions get made properly. Run together, sugar wins every time, because it is cheaper, easier, faster to prepare, and produces a visible result in the weight of the box, while protein produces no visible result at all until the following spring, which is precisely why it gets skipped. The two also have different deadlines. Sugar can be added late and still count toward winter weight. Protein has to arrive while the winter generation is actually being reared, and after that window, it is not late, it is irrelevant. It is also why the two questions want asking in a particular order. Protein first, because it has the tighter deadline and the consequence that cannot be corrected later. Sugar second, because it can be added almost until the weather closes in. There is one genuine complication that deserves naming rather than tidying away. Everything above assumes a normal season with a real dearth and a colony that had a chance to store. In a year when the spring flow failed, or in an apiary carrying more colonies than the forage supports, or in regions where the summer gap runs for months, the calculus shifts and sustained feeding may be the only thing keeping colonies alive. Local conditions genuinely override a general rule here, and a beekeeper whose neighbors all feed heavily in August is probably not surrounded by fools. Anyone in one of those situations should disregard everything here rather than follow it into a starved apiary. The rule that survives everywhere is the narrower one. Find out what each colony actually has before deciding what it needs. What strikes me looking back is how much of my early feeding was about me. A dearth is an uncomfortable thing to watch. The entrances go quiet, the boxes stop gaining, and doing nothing feels like negligence, even when it is the correct call. Boiling syrup and filling feeders converts that discomfort into activity, and activity feels like care. It took me an embarrassingly long time to notice that the hives I fed most anxiously were not the hives that did best, and rather longer to accept what that implied. There is a general version of that worth carrying, and it applies well beyond feeders. In beekeeping, the interventions that feel most like care are frequently the ones aimed at the beekeeper's discomfort rather than at the colony's condition, and they are correspondingly hard to give up. Doing nothing on purpose is a skill. It looks identical to neglect from outside, and nobody sells anything that helps you do it. I notice the same instinct in myself with other tools now, and I distrust it more than I used to. When an intervention makes me feel better immediately and the colony shows no result for months, the odds are reasonable that the intervention was for me. The tell is timing. When an intervention makes the beekeeper feel better immediately and the colony shows no result for months, the odds are reasonable that the intervention was for the beekeeper. The traditional practice, before feeding became a default, was closer to what the Hefting suggests. Beekeepers who could not buy sugar cheaply left more honey on the hive at harvest and fed rarely, and the judgment they exercised was about how much to take rather than how much to give back. There is no nostalgia in that observation. Those beekeepers were restrained by the price of sugar rather than by principle, and the practice that resulted happened to land closer to what the colonies needed. But the outcome is instructive regardless of what produced it. The practical version is that the most effective feeding decision available in August was made in July, with a hive tool, deciding what to leave behind. So the sequence, if it is useful: heft the row before deciding anything. Feed only the light ones. Use heavy syrup rather than thin at this point in the season. Put it inside the box at dusk with the entrance reduced and nothing spilled. Keep the protein question separate from the sugar question, and check the weight again a fortnight later to find out whether it worked. None of that requires equipment beyond a feeder, and most of it consists of not doing things. The only part needing discipline is the first item, because everything downstream depends on having actually checked rather than assumed, and checking is the step easiest to skip when the syrup is already made. Everything else on the list is either free or takes 10 minutes. The thing I would tell my younger self, standing over that pan of syrup, is that the discomfort of watching a quiet apiary in a dearth is not evidence that anything is wrong. Most of those colonies had it in hand, and were telling me so through the back of the box, if I had known to ask. Do you feed in August as a matter of routine, or only when a hive tells you it needs it? And have you ever fed one that turned out not to want it? Leave your experience in the comments. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping. And if you want the full breakdown of why protein rather than sugar is what builds a colony that survives the winter, that one is next. I still keep sugar in the shed, and I still use it, most years, on 2 or 3 hives out of a yard. What changed is that I now find out which one's first. Sugar still lives in the shed, and still gets used most years, on 2 or 3 hives out of a yard, rather than on all of them. What changed was finding out which one's first.